Okay, good afternoon. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the Public Safety, Civil Rights, and Emergency Management Committee. Today is October 26, 2016. My name is Blong Yang. I'm the chair of this committee, and with me today are council members Wright, Palmisano, Gordon, and Quincy, and I believe Council President Johnson will be joining us shortly here, if we're not done with this already. Today we have 6 items on our agenda. 4 of them are consent and 2 are discussion items. And I should also mention that we do have a quorum, so we can conduct this business of the committee with 5 of 6. 6 items, 2 are discussion items, 4 are consent items, and I will start with the consent items first. And the consent items are, number 1, a grant award from the Department of Public Safety, Office of Traffic Safety for DWI Enforcement Officer. Second item is a contract amendment with the BCA for analysis of DNA case evidence. Third item is a travel expense donation acceptance from PERF. And the fourth item is a travel expense donation acceptance from the National Network of Safe Communities at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Anyone want to pull any items for discussion? All right, seeing none. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Motion carries. Okay. Our first discussion item is a police department response time director report. And with us today is Robin McPherson.
Mr. Chair. Mr. Chair, council members, this is the third quarter police report, staffing response reports ending 9/30/2016. And I've placed a hard copy in front of you, and I apologize for not sending it electronically, but I understand it will be linked later today. Just really kind of a brief overview, and then you can ask and get into details if there's any questions. But in general, the response times have remained fairly consistent for priority 1. That's been an emphasis in our precincts, while 2 and 3, as the summer months continue, has gone up slightly. But again, our concentration is trying to hold the priority 1 calls to a similar response time as in the past. You can see on the next slide, again, very similar with the priority 1, and again with the priority 2 and priority 3 creeping up a little bit. Again, these are divided out by the phases of the response times. In general, and again, I'm not going to go over each precinct, but the information is there on a precinct by precinct basis, including the number of response calls. But again, for pretty much all the precincts, we're seeing a consistent response time for priority 1s between 2015 and 2016 for Q3. And again, with some exceptions, we're seeing a consistent trend of the priority 2 and priority 3 increasing. In the past, I think it was during the second quarter, there was a request to show the number of calls by type, and so we are now including that in the report, and you can see that by type, by precinct, to get an idea on the different precincts. And I can't say that there's a trend at this point because we really don't have this data broken out going in the past. And then last but not least, and I apologize for going through this quickly, you can see the staffing levels by precinct. This is complete staffing, this is sworn staffing. And if you'll notice that for the most part, with the exception of precinct 5, all of our precincts have pretty much either similar or slightly more staffing than we had a year ago, which trends with the average number of FTEs that we've had within the department between the 2 years. Are there any questions?
Ms. McPherson, could I ask you, with regards to if there are anything such as national standards, I mean, where should we be in terms of, let's say, priority 1 phone calls?
That's an excellent question, and I'm probably not the one to answer that. I think that what we would have to do, I'll have to get back with you
Okay.
and find out if there is a national standard. I don't know that.
Okay.
Good question, though.
Councilmember Palmisano?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So year to year, our response time overall, it seems like in all precincts, is going up, but staffing isn't what's changing it if you just look at the past 2 years. I know that it's a hard metric to measure because we do want our officers to be spending as much time as possible from call to call. But it also doesn't seem to be directly correlated to the number of calls coming in year to year, that there's an increased number of calls. So what is it that the additional time year to year would be attributed to from your perspective?
Sure. Mr. Chair, Councilmember Palmisano, the rest of the council, I think that during the budget presentation, Chief Arto spoke pretty in-depth about some of the different expectations that have occurred over the year regarding the officers. There are many more officers now who are walking beats than there were a year ago, and so the response time would not be as great because they're not in the cars to get there as quickly. The other thing is there is definitely the emphasis on spending more time in answering the calls and answering questions and trying to engage the community a little bit more. So I think we're starting to see that. So on one side, it's really a positive because I think we're engaging much more with the community than we did a year ago today. On the other side, it definitely does impact our response times. But what we're trying to do is lessen the impact for priority 1 calls, since those are the primary emergency calls, and keep those at a steady rate. And we're seeing the push on the priority 2 and priority 3.
Okay, thank you.
Ms. McPherson, on our web link, we see the numbers for Q2, and why are they so different? I mean, for Q2 of this past year, I mean, the number was, for let's just use the 4th precinct. The number was 9 minutes and 13 seconds, and for this one right here, I mean, it's a full minute and a half more. I mean, how does that get explained? I mean, outside of just the fact that one was the second quarter and one was the third quarter.
I think one of the issues here is that if there's anything out of the norm, it's still going to be picked up. So we're not taking out the outliers in either direction, so that you almost need to look at a call by call basis instead of looking at that. If there's a specific area that you'd like us to look into, we certainly can do that and look at the calls for that particular precinct.
Right, but I mean, I think it's across the board though. On every single precinct here. I mean, if you're looking at what was posted for the second quarter of 2016, I mean, just the numbers are just staggering in terms of priority 1 phone calls and the response times. I mean, the response times are probably in the 9s here, and then on this Q3, I mean, everything is almost probably in the 10s. Except, well, I mean, everything's in the 10s except for precinct 1 and 2.
I think, Mr. Chair, I think that, if you look at it consistently, though, from year to year, you'll see that that is the same trend from last year as it was to this year. And so I guess this is purely speculation, but these were the summer months compared to earlier in the year. And so I think you probably are going to see more officers who are walking a beat than in the car, where in the second quarter you would not see that quite as much. I think that you probably have more people who are trying to engage in the community during the summer months when there's more people out too. So I would think that would have a pretty significant impact, but I will be happy to ask and find out if that's the case.
Yeah, could you check on that? Just because I'm not theorizing or anything like that, but I mean, it seems like from what I've looked at, I mean, it just seems like that's a plausible explanation is just this idea that for the different seasons, we have different types of response times, and the correlation just seems so there, I think. Okay, well, thank you. Council members, any other questions? Council President Johnson?
Mr. Chair, and I was going to call the chief about this, but I'll ask you now that as long as you're here. I was thinking about this after the budget presentation the other day, looking at staffing levels over the years. In 2009, we had gotten, as I remember her presentation, up to almost 900 officers in authorized strength. Would you just check and see if we ever actually got that many people on staff? I'm kind of curious about that.
Council President, I'd be happy to look
Thank
at
you.
it. But you said 2009 was
Yes, it was
what the year?
2009, which kind of
Sure.
surprised me just looking at that
Mhm.
graph. Thank you.
Right. I don't see any other questions. Thank you, Ms. McPherson. So with this matter, I will move that we receive and file this report. Any discussion? All right, seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion carries. Thank you. And we are on to our sixth item, which is a discussion item as well, and it's a domestic violence yearly update report. And with us to do the reports are our city attorney, Susan Siegel. And Susan, if you want to introduce anyone else, please do so.
All right. All right, I've got my domestic violence team manager here, Michelle Jacobson, also our tech wizard here, lining things up. Thank you, and thank you again for taking the time out to hear our annual update. I continue to be just so proud of the work of Michelle and the domestic violence team in our office, as well as our partners in this endeavor for doing the day-to-day hard work, as well as continually to innovate, improve, and provide better services in this area. As you all may recall, it was back in 2007 that the City Council took a pledge to reduce domestic violence in the city of Minneapolis, and we've made huge progress since then. Still a lot of work to do, but we've developed the Minneapolis model using an evidence-based prosecution model and a coordinated community response. And I know that Michelle and Assistant Chief Chris Arneson and others have done trainings around the state and elsewhere on the work that we are doing right here in Minneapolis. And I want to just take a minute and introduce Michelle Jacobson. You all know Assistant Chief Chris Arneson and Deputy Chief Bruce Fulkins, who's in charge of investigations. Commander Melissa Chido, in charge of the investigations unit over the family violence unit. Claudia Waring is here from Asian Women United. Thank you for your partnership. And Sarah Klein, who's the executive director of the Domestic Abuse Project. And we also have Paula Krachowski Barrett here from our office, who is actually housed down in the family violence unit of MPD and works with the investigators day in, day out on the work that they're doing. We're going to update you just briefly here on two of our newer initiatives. The first is the work we've been doing with the Federal Violence Against Women Act grant on our gone on arrival cases. And the second is our violent crime hotspots domestic violence initiative, which is really just unique and groundbreaking work. And we have a meeting, as a matter of fact, at 4 o'clock this afternoon with the county to discuss this proposal that a family navigator social worker work with police department starting in the 4th precinct to follow up on cases where there's not a criminal charge or a police report that follows, but where there's a clear need with the family. So I'm going to turn it over to Michelle at this point.
I want to first of all, thank you for having us here each October. It's a great opportunity for us to get a chance to talk to you about our work regarding domestic violence. I especially want to thank the council for all their support over the years. Without your support, we couldn't do the work because it is very labor intensive. And so we're very appreciative for all you've done for us and for our partners. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've done overall. And one of the biggest things is the idea of collaboration. Domestic violence is not something that we can fight alone. And so we've built a very strong coordinated community response to domestic violence here in Minneapolis and in Hennepin County. And on the screen, you can just see some of the committees and partnerships that we have to allow us to address this issue, not just as a single agency or as a single city, but in coordination with both our community and government-based partners. We are, one of the big things that we have planned coming up, and that's kind of in the next steps section, but we are planning to hold a meeting with more community partners in the city because we realize that we have increasingly large populations of new people in the city, and we'd like to work with even more agencies and coordinate more with them. And so that's one of our projects that we'll be trying to launch still this year and then beginning in 2017 going forward. Another very important piece is our outreach and training for our partners. Our office sponsored a criminal justice partners training in the spring. We had 60 people attend, everyone from law enforcement officers to advocates to child protection workers from all over the county. And we have another one scheduled for this November. It's been a great opportunity for us to get to know them and them to get to know us. We also do active training with multiple police jurisdictions, and we did some roll call trainings this year. I have to give Paula credit for all of that, for our officers to remind them of the importance of what they're doing on domestic violence calls. They have a lot of things that they have to do on each call, and so this was a great opportunity to remind them. We do training for the new judges. I spoke at a nationwide conference in San Diego earlier this year to talk about our Veterans Court and Domestic Violence Court. And then we talked about the Hotspots project at the Crime Victims Conference up in Brainerd earlier this year. And I think it's just a great opportunity for us to let others know around the state and around the country about the good work we're doing here in Minneapolis. A conviction rate is one metric that we can use, and our conviction rate has stayed stable. It's very hard to find comparative data from around the country, but our numbers are good. 68% last year, and we're trending about the same this year for our domestic violence conviction rate. So we talked about the Violence Against Women Act grant that we've had for the last 3 years that focused on the gone on arrival police reports where the suspect has fled. Our grant goals were numerous. I'm not going to go through those, but I'm very proud to say that almost at the end of our 3 years, that we have exceeded all expectations in that grant. And we're particularly grateful to our partners in the police department and at the county attorney's office for their strong commitment to this domestic violence work. One of the things we said is we were going to charge more cases. Before we had this grant that placed an additional police investigator to look at the misdemeanor level cases that normally MPD does not have the resources to look at, we charged 25 cases. Last year, we charged 110 cases, so that's a huge increase. This year, through mid-year, we were at 45 cases. The number of cases charged is a little bit down this year, but we have charged significantly more felony level cases and stalking cases, which are particularly concerning for victims because they generally involve repeated violations of some kind of no contact order. I'm also extremely pleased to say that our conviction rate for these cases has remained high. There are some jurisdictions that charge every single domestic violence case that they can, and so the number of cases they charge when the suspect has fled is much higher than ours. But even though we've increased the number of cases that we've charged, our conviction rate has remained high, which means that people, when we charge them, know that there are consequences for their actions, and that it's not just another knock against the victim. Even more impressive is with this additional investigator, we've been able to decrease the amount of time or the delay in charging cases. When I train police, I often talk to them about how domestic cases are more like Boone's Farm than fine wine. They don't always age particularly well. That usually gets a laugh out of them, and they tend to like that when they feel a little bit more connected to me, so I'll share that with all of you as well. But this Violence Against Women Act has really been able to speed up how fast cases come into the system. And that's very important because what the statistics tell us is that the most dangerous time for a victim is oftentimes right after the incident happens. And the other thing that we know is for the offenders, that the sooner the consequences for their action can be to that action, the more effective they are. So for example, in the past, it used to take us almost 73 days before we charged a case. This year, we're down to 27 days. Case resolution, it used to take us almost half a year for this case to go through the system. We're down to less than 100 days now for these gone on arrival cases, which are some of the most difficult to prosecute. Now, unfortunately, our Violence Against Women Act grant is ending this year. I have it from good authority from MPD that they will be continuing our investigator down there. Now, I've said that on the record, so they can't back out. So I'm locking the deputy chief and the assistant chief in here, but they're the ones who told me. So I don't think they'll yell at me too much for saying that today. But it is the strong commitment of the police department that has enabled us to be as successful in this. And we can't say enough about the support that they've given us. And, you know, when you were talking to Ms. McPherson earlier about the delays and why, you know, it's taking officers longer to get to calls, I kind of felt a little bit responsible myself because we're consistently asking police officers to do more and more on the calls so that we can have prosecutable cases. So it's not, I won't take the blame for everything, but I will say the prosecutors play a role in the time that the police spend on individual calls. Then moving on to our newest project, our Hotspots project. That Hotspots project really was a coordination with the police department as well. We've talked about this before, but there's around 17,000 911 calls each year that are domestic violence related. As we started looking into some of that data, we found that only about 20 to 25% of those calls actually result in a police report being made. Now, as we looked further into the data, we also realized that the police were doing the right thing. The majority of the calls, and the data doesn't show it all right here, when there is not an arrest made, it's because the facts of that incident don't support an arrest. It's about people being out of control, maybe an argument, maybe a dispute over property. And so what we realized, though, is in the majority of cases, the victim of that domestic violence incident had reached out to the police or to the system for help, and no one was helping them because there was no follow-up being done. The cops got there, they assessed the situation, made a determination that a police report couldn't be made, and the victim didn't get any follow-up assistance because no one really knew about the call. With our Hotspots project, we formed a team, and one of the other things, we focused on the violent crime hotspots because, interestingly enough, the number one reason that people called 911 in those hotspots was for domestic violence related areas. And so these are the areas in North Minneapolis that we focused on. We also are working in South Minneapolis. You can see the hotspots on there with one additional area that we're working in, which is the Boson Terrace area that does not appear on that map. It is not a violent crime hotspot, but it is a domestic violence hotspot. And so we are also working in there as well. And so what the hotspot team does is we have conducted a follow-up home visit there. And I talk like I'm going out and doing the visits. No, it's not me. It's actually two people who are far more qualified than me, a police officer from that precinct, and then a family therapist from the domestic abuse project. They go out, they offer services, talk to the people about what's going on, and really we gather information in the hopes that we can improve how we are responding to domestic violence in those homes. These are our goals, and I'm happy to say that after doing this for about a year and a half, we have been very successful in reaching these goals. And I'll just share one story right now here. Oops, no, actually just one second. Just kind of telling you what we've done so far. So far, we've made 858 different hotspots visits. We've visited 668 different addresses. amazingly, even though this is just a cold call, it's like someone walking up to your door and knocking on there, you don't expect them. We've had a 70% success rate in talking to someone at the address, and oftentimes we're actually talking to one of the parties involved in the call or multiple parties involved in the call. The team has spoken to over 480 different people. One of the biggest things is we've increased the awareness of domestic violence resources and other community-based resources for those people. What people were telling us is they were talking about the issues in their home, but anywhere between 10 and 20% of those people said, I don't know where to go for services. What the therapists have also told us is sometimes it's not just I don't know where to go. I don't have the resources to get there. I have 4 kids. I don't have money for the bus. I don't have anyone to watch my kids so I can go there. And so what we've been doing is taking that information and we're trying to build the project so we can make it sustainable, because obviously we're not going to be able to do follow-up visits, unfortunately, for the rest of our lives. But we're trying to take that information so that that initial police response can be more effective and we can actually address the issues going on in the home rather than just alleviating a crisis. And one of the things that's, as I said, we're trying to increase our own awareness of what is going on and how we can intervene more effectively.
Ms. Jacobson,
Yep.
can you pause for a second? Councilmember Quincy?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. If you could go back one slide, it would be
Yeah.
helpful for me. I'm just looking at the first 2 numbers there, 858, 668.
Yep.
Is it fair to assume that there could be a duplication, making multiple visits there? Or
So,
what's the difference between those 200?
So there are some addresses that we've been there multiple times, but there's 668 addresses, separate addresses that we've visited. So that's the difference between the 2 numbers.
Right. And is this part of an investigation, or is this just follow-up totally separate from an investigation?
Councilmember Quincy, this has nothing to do with the prosecution of the cases. I know coming from the prosecutor's office, it seemed like it would be something we would do, but no, we were really, and this is a lot of due to Susan's great work, as she's doing with our chronic offenders. We're not just looking at how can we lock people up, how can we prosecute them. We're really looking at how can we address these issues outside of the criminal justice system. What I know from my work in domestic violence is the majority of times the victims tell us they want to see the case dismissed, but at the same time they tell us they want the violence to stop. And so this is our opportunity to reach out before a criminal case even happens, before a conviction happens, so it's more difficult for them to find a job, find housing. So our hope is that we can intervene before it even comes to us in the courts, because that is not always the most effective way to deal with this. Unfortunately, sometimes that is the only way to force someone into the programming, but our hope is that we will connect people with services before they even come into the court system.
Yeah, very important work. Do you track the information that, are there children in the home?
We do track that information. We have a 2-page log that we use, and some of the information on there is who else lives at the home, how are the kids doing in school. We don't go back, we don't report things to Child Protection, but we do look at it because one of our goals for this project is to figure out better ways to intervene. So knowing who lives in the home, what the issues are is helping us as we plan for the next steps for this project and increasing connections to services and what type of services do we need to have available for the people in the homes.
Very good. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Council President Johnson?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So when we have a duplication of almost 200 addresses here, where be more than one call to a particular address, what's the red flag there, or how do we target, what's the outcome of having to go back to the same address numerous times?
Well, Mr. Chair, Council President Johnson, one of the things that we know about domestic violence is that it often takes a victim 6 or 7 times before they'll leave a situation. So the fact that we don't have success on the first call is that's to be expected when you're working with a domestic violence call. What we have seen with the repeated calls is sometimes the second or third call is when we really make that connection with that person. And I've talked a lot to the therapists who are going out on the projects, and they get to know the people. They sometimes feel more comfortable with them on that later visit, and they're willing to share more information. The other thing the fact that we know we're going back to repeated addresses is one of the issues that we are addressing, and Susan talked about it earlier, is this idea of a family navigator position that we are proposing to the Hennepin County Human Services and Public Health Department. What the family navigator would be a county employee who would be housed somewhere near the 4th precinct. So both our hotspot team and officers in the 4th precinct could make direct referrals to this family navigator when they have an address where they've gone multiple times and where the problem is not one that they can arrest the way out of, but instead involves issues more like mental health, children out of control, chemical dependency. What that family navigator would do would be able to go to the home, do a follow-up visit, affirmatively offer services. We're not asking someone in crisis to go, oh, if you come downtown here to the government center or even to the service center in North Minneapolis, we're actually going out and affirmatively offering them help to navigate the system, which can be very confusing and overwhelming for people. So that's one of the things that these multiple address calls has led us towards, and that is one of the ways that we think we can potentially make this program sustainable, because it would be there as a resource for every officer if they're going back to addresses similar to what they do with problem properties now, would have someone to go who is trained to deal with that instead of trained to be a police officer. And ultimately, if we fund this in the 4th precinct, my hope and my dream is that it will be successful and that we'll go back in future years and ask for one in the 3rd precinct, in the 2nd precinct, in the 1st, and the 5th, and that'll be a partnership that we can sustain for the future.
Okay, Mr. Chair. You mentioned that on these hotspot visits, though, if you saw some child issue, it would be reported to Child Protection.
Yep, they are mandated reporters,
Okay,
and so
okay.
that is, but it's not our goal to go out and do
Okay,
that.
great. Thank you.
Councilmember Palmisano.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It says 858 hotspot visits. Is that all of the attempts, or is that the 70% contact rate?
That is all of the addresses so it's 100% of the attempts.
Okay. So that's a pretty, I wish I had a door knocking contact rate of 70%.
I agree, that was quite a surprise for me as well.
A couple other questions just to make sure I'm understanding and placing everything correctly. The Family Navigator proposition is citywide, not specific to hotspots, right?
Councilmember Palmisano, Mr. Chair, right now we are proposing it as a pilot for the 4th precinct. We would not limit it to the hotspots. It would be available to the 4th precinct. I would love to sell it to the county as something that we could go citywide with, but our hope is that we can launch it as a pilot there and then quickly expand it to the whole city.
Okay, and then does that seem sufficient for a meaningful pilot? I mean, so before, when I was thinking it was citywide, I was looking at your other figures and thinking 17,000 domestic violence calls, 20 to 25% where no police report is filed. It still seemed to leave about 4,000 calls in one person's queue to decide to follow up on or try to follow up on or not. Is it seen that we would get meaningful data from one family navigator position?
Our hope is that that'll just be a start, because some of the 17,000 calls do result in arrests. Some are one-time incidences, so not every 911 call needs the same level of follow-up. Our hope is that we'll pilot this, and then if it turns out that there is more need, then we'll ask for more. We are also right now writing a grant proposal with the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center to fund a similar family navigator for the Native American community at Little Earth, because that is another one of our hot spots. So if we get that grant funding, we'd have a navigator working out of the Little Earth area with the Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center.
And then my last question is, I'm not sure if I recall this correctly. Was there a grant that recently concluded in terms of funding for the hotspots work?
Councilmember Palmisano, no, we did not receive a grant to do that work. It all came out of the mayor's budget, and it is in her proposed budget for 2017 as well. So our hopes and our plans are that we will receive that funding and be able to continue that work.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair and Councilmember Palmisano, just to follow up on that point, we did ask the mayor included in her recommendations funding for this pilot for one more year, at which point we're hopeful that and the county's been a great partner, and they've been participating in the meetings that Michelle's been chairing, that we'll be able to try this family navigator position, and that'll be the sustainability model, so that this pilot will end at the end of 2017. We've gathered a lot of information. We thought it was particularly helpful because these are in these persistent, over time, violent crime areas, and will help us learn and understand what some of the needs are of the families there, in the hopes of reducing that level of violence overall, and trying to develop a more proactive human services delivery model, when there's not a crime. Because this focuses on situations where there's a need. The police are spending a lot of time responding because they're getting a 911 call, but it's not because criminal activity has actually happened. People need help getting somebody out of their house, for example, but it's not necessarily a crime, or at least a prosecutable crime. So it's really trying to focus in there, understand and learn more, and there's a lot of data that's been collected, information. That sounds better than data, because these are about human beings and issues that they're facing, and hoping to put social services doing social service work, again, helping to free up our officers to really focus on on public safety issues. So I hope that's helpful. We did lose, and I did mention in our budget, we didn't lose. We weren't awarded a new federal Violence Against Women Act grant. And so we are going to have to work on transitioning this gone on arrival work. We're grateful that the police department is going to keep this investigator, this additional investigative help at the Domestic Abuse Service Center, which will make a big difference. And we're hopeful that we've now institutionalized these other measures that the Violence Against Women Act grant we've had for the last 3 years has funded.
Thank you.
And just a couple additional things we're doing towards the sustainability piece. The other thing that we're working on developing is some kind of handout that can be precinct specific that officers could access through the MPD website, so that if they go to a home, they'd have a quick link to say, if the issue is more chemical dependency, they can actually get a good resource for people because it's available for them. We'll be promoting that with officers as soon as we develop that. But that is one other piece that we could deal with, because officers have a lot of things to remember. And so adding a link to the Hennepin County Human Services website where they have a lot of that information available, but where people can go, is one of the other pieces that we're looking at for sustainability. Just one other, just kind of, and those statistics and the data, as Susan said, are just, they're just data and statistics. Some of us like them, but really these impact people. And I have one quote on here that a woman who the Hotspots team visited back in April said, she said, "Thanks for caring enough to check in on us. I was pulling some data for a meeting for later this week, and this is what another woman said after a hotspot visit. This was in September in South Minneapolis. It feels good to me and makes me feel happy that people are looking out for me. That really gets to this piece of engagement, seeing the police as a helper, not just a person there who's out to arrest them. And I think that's one of the hidden benefits of this project that's not noted in data anywhere. People are seeing that the city that cares about them and they're willing to come back and follow up when it's not responding to an exact crisis. The police and DAP therapists also have found this to be a useful project. They say people, not every time, obviously not everyone wants to talk to them, but they look forward to they thank them for their visit after they get over that initial wariness, and it really has made a huge impact on people. So just talking about our next steps right now. The project will be funded next year in the mayor's proposed budget if that is approved. We are meeting with Hennepin County to talk about this family navigator position, and we are writing a grant with Minnesota Indian Women's Resource Center to fund one at Little Earth. We're developing the resource link for officers, and I included that on there. And then just some other things related to our work with DV. Just to speak generally about the VAWA grant, we do have a commitment from MPD to fund the investigator at DAP, but we will need to find funding for our advocates in room 108. They've been working out of there since 2003, and so that's something that we'll be looking since the funding for those positions was lost in the grant. We are looking to engage more community partners. We're going to be holding a community forum before the end of the year with more partners to talk about what we can do better to engage the community and what the community needs as far as domestic violence. And then one other piece, we have written a grant that did not get funded, but where we would like to research the effectiveness of our case resolution in reducing future violence. We did that with a professor from Hamlin and Portland State University, where they would look at what the result of a case, whether it was charged, not charged, dismissed, what type of conviction we got, to see how that effect on future recidivism. The first application we made, we did not get funded, but we got very positive responses on that. So we will be looking in the next year to find a place to fund that work, and that would be groundbreaking work in the field of domestic violence. So we're hopeful that we will find that, because oftentimes we do offer reduced pleas in domestic violence because it has a more positive or less of a negative impact on the families. And so we do want to see if that is as effective as asking for a plea to the top charge and getting jail time and other things in reducing future violence. So that's one of our next plans for the future.
All right, thank you. Council members, any questions? Ms. Jacobson, a couple things. One is the presentation in itself. I don't see it linked on the agenda, and so if you can give that information to Ms. Casper to link it, that would be wonderful. Just shows the wonderful work that you all have done, and it's almost like if it's not published, on the web, it's not really real. So if you could do that, that'd be wonderful.
If it's on the internet, it's true, right?
That's right. That's right. And, the other thing is, you kind of open the door a little bit. And so I'm just going to go and ask you this question. Or, if you can explain a little bit further. You had said earlier that prosecutors play a role in slowing response times. And, we won't say that too loudly, but can you kind of explain that a little bit just so that the viewing public understands what that means? And that'd be great.
Sure, council member, or chair. What that means is, when I first started as a prosecutor, police officers wrote very, very short police reports. They were 1 or 2 sentences long. For some crimes, that's enough for us to prosecute a case successfully. If they see someone, for example, drinking a beer in public, if the police report says, I walked up, I saw John Doe standing there drinking a beer, I smelled it, it was beer, that's enough for us to prosecute the case. Unfortunately, for other types of cases, we need more information if we're going to be able to go forward with the case. So one of the things we've done over the years is train police officers on how to write more in-depth police reports. Domestic violence is one area where we've asked police officers to write longer reports. Those longer reports give us enough information so that we can proceed with prosecution because we have more details. We know more about what the incident started over. And so that is why I say I take the blame, because we've done a lot of training with officers so that they write longer reports, they ask more questions. And what that does is it allows us to prosecute cases successfully, keep victims safe, and hold offenders accountable for their actions.
So essentially what you're saying is that officers who respond to 911 phone calls, sometimes they tend to stay a little bit longer to get more details so that they could write the reports. And so that takes a little bit of time away from them responding to their next phone call. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. And our
Okay.
hope is, Mr. Chair, that by spending a little bit more time on that one call, that it can reduce future calls to that same address for the same thing. So while that one individual call may take a little bit longer to deal with, they won't have to go back to that address 4, 5, or 6 times in the future, because we'll be able to have a successful intervention that first time as opposed to having 5 or 6 calls.
Okay. Thank you, Ms. Jacobson. Council members, any other questions? Seeing none, Ms. Jacobson, thank you so much. Ms. Eagle, thank you. And thank you to everyone here who has contributed to just the good work that we're all doing with regards to domestic violence. And council members, with that, I will move that we receive and file this report. Any discussion? All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Motion carries. And with that, we are done with our business for today, and so we will adjourn this meeting. Thank you.